Bread. Your daily bread. Such an important staple for so many people around the world. But whatever you think the history is that really what it is? Well, today we'll be discussing the true history of bread. Welcome to Tingledom. You probably have a vague idea of what you think the history of bread is. Probably goes something like wheat was domesticated around the Fertile Crescent, or, in ancient Egypt, maybe we saw a rise in bread. But the history of bread actually stretches back much further and much wider across the globe than that limited history would suggest. So before we get into the history of bread, we need to make sure that we are knowing what we're talking about, because a nice fluffy loaf of grocery store bread didn't even exist 150 years ago, we'll say. But that's not the only type of bread that there is, and I think we would still call bread from 150 years ago bread. So what is our definition of bread? Bread is a staple food prepared from a dough of flour and water, usually by baking. So then, what constitutes flour? It's a powder made by grinding raw grains, roots, beans, nuts, or seeds. So basically, bread is ground up grains, roots, beans, nuts, or seeds, and prepared usually by baking. So in our more well-known history of bread, particularly in ancient Egypt, you do have leavened bread. So you'll have bread that will rise. You have those air pockets in there that provide structure for the bread. That comes from wild yeast. They would save the dough from one day to the next, because that would keep your yeast alive, which would provide that fluffiness to the bread. Even though they probably were quite coarse breads, because they would have been whole grains. But you want to look at probably other types of bread to understand a bit more how bread would have first been made. So if we think about all the different types of bread, we've got tortillas. Tortillas are a flat bread, very thin, but that's flour that's been ground up and cooked to some level. And we have flatbreads all over the world. And it's much more likely that the first breads were these types of flatbread, because that doesn't require leavening, because that's a little bit more of a process. And only wheat really lends itself to that leavening process because of its high gluten content. So, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, we're talking about just a few thousand years ago. But the history of bread stretches much further back. Now we're going to start before we know for sure that bread did exist. So I'm going to look at Lake Nyassa, which is right here. So, Lake Nyassa, and we're looking at 105,000 years ago. So, many, many generations ago. So there's research that shows that at this site that's been dated to 105,000 years ago, there are starch granules which are present on the tools found in the site, which is indicative that the people that were living there were eating grains and using the tools with them. Now, we don't have anything in particular that shows a grinding action to create flour, so probably would be a stretch to say that they'd be having bread then. But it is quite significant just to think from, if you think about paleo diets or anything like that, to think that 105,000 years ago, humans were eating grains and there were the starch. So that's 105,000 years ago. Now, our more interesting, getting into legitimate breads here. And this is not well publicized. So the Wikipedia article up until August of last year didn't even have reference to any of this. So this is not well publicized research, but there is evidence of bread making 30,000 years ago. So, in Cuddie Springs, I'm going to spin around the globe. So Cuddie Springs is about right here in New South Wales. And from Cuddie Springs, we have a grinding stone. So this is a stone which shows that it was used to grind probably seeds. There weren't any sort of wheat and that sort of thing. Usually grass seeds or millet type seeds. And grasses, but not really wheat type. And so our earliest evidence for bread does come from Australia and with Indigenous people. And this site, if you think about it, if we think all the way back 30,000 years ago, so at this site in Cuddie Springs, the megafauna were still there. So if you imagine rhinoceros-sized kangaroos going across the land, the Diprotodon, and you'd have Thylacoleo, which was an ambush predator from above, and had a very fearsome thumbnail, a very fearsome animal. And so this is a very important site showing that back then they could have been having a Diprotodon sandwich with flatbread. So bread all the way 30,000 years ago. So don't let anybody tell you that a paleo diet is without grains. Now we also have 30,000 years ago up in our European area in Italy, Russia, and the Czech Republic. There have also been grinding stones found. And so in these grinding stones, even though they're in European areas, we don't see wheat and barley and those more typical things. We see cattails and ferns and the like. So really interesting precursor and part of the diet at that time. So the processing to eat those food to get enough energy out of them, it's hypothesized that this would have included peeling the roots, drying, and then finally grinding the root, and then that would be cooked into probably a flatbread. So 30,000 years ago, if you're in this part of the world, you'd be eating fern and cattail. Down here, you'd be eating your extra size kangaroo and seed flatbreads. Oh, now we're back over here. So the next site is actually quite close to our Cuddie Springs site. We're still in New South Wales. It's just down here. And this site doesn't have it has a wider age range for when it's been dated. Not sure exactly. It's been dated to 14 to 25,000 years ago. And we've got grinding stone also from this area. And we have grinding stones that were made of sandstone. And so what the scientists and archaeologists do to figure out what's actually on the grinding stone is they pull out molecules and analyze them under the microscope to look at all the little microstructures to identify what is actually there. So in these stones they found starch, cellulose, and also collagen. Now collagen comes from animal origin, so it's believed that these would have been used for grinding seeds to make bread, but also that they may have ground lizards and different animals in there for other purposes. Then if we come back over here to 23,000 years ago, where are we? We're in the Sea of Galilee, which is going to be in present-day Israel. So the Sea of Galilee, in a site called Ohallo II, which is an ancient human settlement. And for those who like to eat wheat bread, this may be an exciting development. So there's a grindstone from this site which shows the grinding of wild barley and potentially wheat at 23,000 years ago. So you can see all this evidence is casting doubt on this kind of neat and tidy story that we domesticated wheat and started grinding it and we made bread, and all of these things were really close together. This is 23,000 years ago and we were potentially grinding wheat. Now there's also evidence at this particular site that there may have been a oven-like hearth. So something to cook it in. It's a little bit more reminiscent to how we would cook today. Now our next site is just a little further over, right here in Jordan, in the Black Desert. And this is one of the most exciting finds. This is from 14,000 years ago. And we have direct evidence of bread making. Can you guess what form it is? Breadcrumbs. So we have historical breadcrumbs from 14,000 years ago. So this predates agriculture, which arose around 4,000 years ago. Fascinating. So that is a little more beefed up history of bread around the world. We obviously know that tortillas came to the Americas as well, so there's been bread around the world. But we then pick up in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So we'll just finish off with a few facts about bread. So bread leavening is dependent on the gluten structure. So gluten forms really long strands, which can allow air to get trapped inside and grow bubbles. So most other breads outside of areas that have wheat have remained as flatbreads. So the Maya and the Inca would have had maize or corn tortillas. And then, of course, we know that wheat was domesticated and leavened bread arose. So that particular type of bread, probably the quintessential bread that you and I think of when we think of bread, is a leavened bread, and that's because of that structure in the wheat. Bread has been an important part of diets across the world for tens of thousands of years. And, of course, ground and cereal starches for even longer. Perhaps even the most important part of the diet. A really interesting fact is the use of bread in medieval times. They would serve their food on a piece of bread, so like a big piece of bread. It was kind of a plate, so it would be like a bread plate. So if you had meats and other foods, they would soak the juices into the bread. And then this bread could be eaten, or it would be served to livestock or to the peasants. And this was called a trencher. There's actually a little medieval spot here in Tingledom where you can go and get a meal served on a trencher. You should check it out. And then we get to the present. So the history of bread, skip past the kind of more traditional parts. We're looking more at the parts that you're not going to hear about other places. But another interesting part about bread is what's really happened over the last 100 years. Bread has been a huge, huge staple for a very long time, all across the world in most places. Not as much in areas that have rice as a primary, but still one of our largest staples. But with industrialization, there's actually been changes to the structure and the way that we eat bread. And there's actually been a decrease in the amount of bread that people eat. So with industrialization, there are additives So your typical supermarket bread that's really fluffy, this can be made, risen, and baked in less than 3 hours. And this is all because of enzymes that are added. And they don't actually have to disclose the enzymes that are used. The idea being that enzymes help as a catalyst, so act to make it go faster, but are consumed in the reaction. But these enzymes don't have to be disclosed. And so these enzymes, the idea is that the enzymes are consumed in the making of the bread, so they're not in the final product. But they do reduce the quality of the bread. And some people suggest that this is the reason for a decline in the consumption of bread, since this bread has less taste and less nutrition. But it's also led to a counterculture with the emergence of more artisanal breads intended to have better nutrition. But it's hard without the disclosure of ingredients to know how it's made and how the fermentation process is actually working. So the best way is to either buy all your bread fresh here in Tingledom, which is made the old-fashioned way, or make your own. And then obviously we're talking that 30,000 years ago we had indigenous people grinding seeds and making bread in New South Wales area. But even obviously, and that's continued on through time, which is something very little is actually spoken about. Part of how Australia was invaded and taken over was with the doctrine of terra nullius, saying this was an uninhabited and unused land, which as more and more is actually learned about Indigenous culture and everything that was happening with Indigenous culture, it's pretty much the exact opposite of what the situation was. And so at the time of invasion, there's evidence that Aboriginal people in Central Australia were eating native millet, spinifex, and supplemented with wattle seed. In other areas there was pigwig, prickly wattle, mulga, dead Finnish seed, and bush beans, all mixed into flours. So a huge variety of breads, and there actually is an emerging interest in Indigenous flowers in Australia, and there's Indigenous growers trying to grow some of these seeds to be able to produce bread that they're hoping the local hipsters will adopt and they can spread the route, because these are seeds that will be able to work with the land, don't require as much any fertilizer or anything like that. They're drought resistant because they naturally come from Australia and would be a very good option. So bread has been around for a very, very long time. Grain eating and processing even longer, 105,000 years, but people have been eating bread on this planet for probably about 30,000 years or more. So don't let people tell you that it's just a new modern trend with agriculture from the past 4,000 years. It's been happening for a long time, and humans have been surviving for a very long time on bread. And just think, there still exists on the world breadcrumbs from 14,000 years ago. enjoy your